What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. In today's episode, I'm going to be going over the Week 9 action. There was a big game in the SEC that has put one team squarely at the top of the standings. I'm going to be going over that game first, but before I do, if you're going to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But starting things out, how about Texas A&M getting the win at home over the LSU Tigers? It was a huge second half for the Aggies. LSU went into halftime up 17-7. They looked to be in control. They weren't doing anything amazing on offense, but they were moving the ball, they were scoring, and they were doing really well in defense. But in the second half, with Marcel Reed taking over at quarterback for Connor Wigman, the Aggies absolutely went off. They scored 31 points in the second half. Reed rushed in 3 touchdowns, and Le'Veon Moss, who I think had the touchdown in the first half for Texas A&M, also ran in a touchdown to finish with a pair of rushing touchdowns in the game. It has to start with what Texas A&M was able to do defensively. They shut down the Tigers in that second half, held them to just 6 points. LSU was not really able to get the ball moving. Garrett Nussmeier threw for over 400 yards, actually, had a couple of touchdowns, but the big thing was his 3 interceptions. The Texas A&M defense and secondary especially did a phenomenal job of limiting a quarterback who ranked going into this game second nationally, I believe, in passing yards, or second in the SEC. I think he was 6th nationally. So it's a huge win for the Aggies. Again, that big second half, and they take sole possession of first place in the SEC. They're the only team that's undefeated. They're 7-1, 5-0 in conference. So Texas A&M is in the driver's seat in the SEC, and the rest of their schedule is, I think, at worst, a 3-1 finish, and at best, and I think realistically so, a 4-0 finish. They're at South Carolina. That can be a tough place to play. Williams-Brice Stadium is a great environment with Sandstorm. New Mexico State at home, that's a win. At Auburn, unless they somehow at the last minute figure out their offense, even on the road, that's a win. That place has not been as much of a fortress as it has been in past years. And then they're home against Texas. That one against the number 6 Longhorns is a little bit more of a question mark. But personally, before the season even began, I said I thought that Texas A&M would win this game. Now, I'll be honest, when I made that prediction, my logic for it was more, this is the first time these two teams are facing off in over a decade. There's going to be a lot of emotions for this one. It's the opportunity for Texas A&M, who I thought was going to be decent, an 8 or 9 win team, to spoil their rivals' season, at least for a week. But this is now an opportunity for Texas A&M to punch their ticket, most likely, to the SEC championship game, unless Texas were to lose before then and get a second loss, and A&M were obviously to win their next 2. But another thing is they've only got to win probably 2 more SEC games, and more than likely they're going to be in Atlanta. Of course, there is a possibility if Georgia has 1 loss, A&M loses that game to Texas, and Texas doesn't lose before then, you would have 3 teams with 1 loss. And I think Texas A&M would miss out then. They might still make it. I'm not sure about the tiebreakers there. But either way, Texas A&M is in the driver's seat, best team in the SEC right now, and they've proved it on the field so far. So a huge win for Texas A&M. Even though they haven't faced a Georgia or Texas, I mean, you could argue that Georgia, because their win over Texas is, but they lost to Alabama. So there's only one team that's undefeated, and that's Texas A&M. So right now, they're the best team in the SEC. Another game, noon Eastern time. A sloppy, uninspiring Ohio State gets by an upset-minded Nebraska. It was not a pretty game for the Buckeyes. A late Jordan Hancock interception sealed it on kind of a throw that made you say, okay, that's a freshman throw by Dylan Raiola, who overall had a fair game. But the big thing for the Buckeyes is they played all right. They did struggle to guard a bit, I noticed, against Thomas Fidone. Now, I will say I have a little bit of an extra eye for him because I work in Council Bluffs, where he went to high school at Lewis Central. So I do obviously keep a little bit of an extra eye on him in any game, just for any sort of story opportunity that might arise. But he was doing well. He was kind of getting open, finding those pockets, either beating his man when it was man coverage or finding those pockets in the zone coverage. He had 4 receptions for 55 yards. I think he could have had even more if the Huskers hadn't kept running those screen passes. Got to question the play calling by Marcus Satterfield a little bit. But Again, I think probably a little bit of missed opportunities because especially I would say Fedoni and then other guys, maybe like a Jalen Lloyd who can get over the top were kind of missed opportunities for the Huskers. But you do got to credit the Buckeyes defense. They had a goal line stand, stopped the Huskers short on 4th and goal, and they also limited the Huskers offense to 3 field goals. However, 3 field goals, it might seem like a negative to some teams, but the fact that all 3 of those were made field goals is a big win for Nebraska, who has struggled mightily with field goals this year, special teams overall. Except for their punting. Their punting has been pretty good this year, but they finally get that breakthrough with a good, clean field goal game. But overall, they're not able to pull out the win. For Nebraska, I think the takeaway here is it is a positive for the future. It shows that they can compete, especially after the massive letdown that they had against Indiana last week. And it kind of does segue, though, into the question for Ohio State. Were the Buckeyes kind of looking ahead, or is this something to be worried about? I think it's a cop-out answer, I'll be honest, but I think it is a little bit of both. I think certainly they're looking ahead. That would explain maybe a little bit of the slow start, but why then did they not get into things? Nebraska's got a good defense, yes, but I don't know. I before the season started, when it was announced that he was coming in, I was very hesitant about Will Howard. He looked good against weaker competition, and aside from a bad decision late, he looked pretty good against Oregon as well, but this game was definitely a step back and kind of brought up some of those questions that I had about Will Howard. But overall, Ohio State does get the win, and they've got that big one that I'll be previewing in my next video, obviously, against Penn State in Happy Valley. Another note that I made, I think Oregon really proved their number 1 status. They were dominant against Illinois in a 38-9 win. I think Dylan Gabriel moved up to 2nd all-time in the all-time list for passing touchdowns in a career. He's had stops at Central Florida and Oklahoma before Eugene, and he's continued to throw touchdown passes at a very high rate while with the Ducks. Illinois, I think, is maybe a little bit of a legit check. I think they still have good wins. I saw some comments on posts of the new AP Top 25. They're still at number 24. They still have a solid win, I think, over a Michigan team that, shout out the Wolverines, was able to get the Paul Bunyan Trophy and see off a little bit of dirty stuff at the end from little brother Michigan State. But Illinois, the legitness question, I think they are still a good team. Now, are they a college football playoff team? No. I think they are fringe top 25. I'd have to go through all those teams that were in that area. I would personally probably have them in the top 25 still, but just kind of addressing some of those questions. Back to the main point, though, another team that's worth consideration is Penn State for kind of that top spot. I think Oregon is the clear number 1, but you always have that conversation of which teams are kind of their next, I guess, contender or competitor. Penn State scored a couple late touchdowns. They're probably looking a little bit ahead. They were at a Wisconsin team, though, that had been playing really well, had won 3 in a row. The game was in Madison, and I think overall it's nothing to be, concerned about for Nittany Lions fans. They get a 28-13 win with a couple of fourth quarter touchdowns. Texas escaped at Vanderbilt too, but that's not the same as what it used to be. Vanderbilt is a really solid football team from the line of scrimmage, all the way back in the defense and obviously in their backfield, especially with Diego Pavia at quarterback. But Texas didn't quite look like that. Georgia was off, so I think it is still Oregon and Georgia, 1 and 2. I think Penn State and Ohio State, they're really going to literally decide who's that number 3 team this week. I think personally they're both just behind Oregon and Georgia. Ohio State did nothing to me to prove that they deserve to be in that consideration, even though they lost so close to Oregon. With this game against Nebraska, I think they kind of dropped further back, even though they didn't move in the polls, but the way they performed. Another thing, Miami looked good, but they have yet to face a ranked opponent. It's kind of the same story as with Indiana. Indiana's more exciting. They moved, maybe not more exciting. I guess they're more unique and unexpected this year. Miami is exciting because of Cam Ward, but Indiana's 8-0 for the first time since 1967. Moving into another point then, BYU is also 8-0 for the first time in a long time. I'll pop up when the last time they was. And in another game, team that was long, that is still an independent, BYU was long and independent, really long time as an independent. Notre Dame is looking really good, and they unfortunately, for those of us who are neutrals in college football, spoiled the midshipman magic. They dominated Navy really from start to finish. That game was never really close. But the Fighting Irish are playing really good football. I think they should cruise the rest of the way. And they also, the more that Texas A&M wins, the more that looks really good. And it's kind of cyclical too, because the more that that Notre Dame wins, the better that loss for Texas A&M even looks. Now, both of those teams, I would say, have a really good shot to finish with one loss, so it won't really matter. But if they do slip up, especially for A&M if it's to Texas, and I guess Notre Dame if it's to USC, but really the Fighting Irish, the only other game they would really reasonably be considered to lose would be Army. But both of those two teams are probably going to finish the regular season with one, A&M maybe two losses. So those two teams kind of helping each other out the more that they continue to win after Notre Dame won in College Station in week 1. Alabama wiped out Missouri. There's a little bit of an asterisk with that. Missouri did have their backup quarterback, and they have not been as good as they were last year, as I kind of personally expected. I thought they would take a step back this season. I do have a friend who's a Missouri fan, so sorry about that. But I did just kind of, I don't know. I know they had Brady Cook and Luther Burden coming back, but I thought the loss of Schrader, their running back, would hurt them. They got some big losses on defense as well, and they just have not looked impressive, even though their record, I think they're a case of a team that probably is not as good as their record indicates. One other storyline kind of to wrap things up here, this will also be something I'll preview in my next video. SMU got a good road win over Duke. They improved to 7-1, and they're setting up actually a really big ACC game. I know we're kind of overlooking the ACC outside of Miami and Clemson. Those two teams do look like they're going to be the ones that are going to meet in Charlotte for the ACC championship game. But this game for SMU coming up, they're going, or they're hosting 8-0 Pitt. So that's going to be a big game. Both teams are ranked maybe in the top 20 or just one of them's, I think SMU's just outside the top 20 right now. I haven't looked over the full new polls yet. But that game is going to be really interesting, especially in the case of either Miami or Clemson slipping up. And so definitely going to be keeping my eyes on that one coming up this week, but I'll talk more about that matchup in my next video. But that's all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burtnett. Thank you so much for watching. I'm signing out. Peace.